is not a novel idea, but in part could this be our failure of the heterogeneity of the patient population? So, you know, medications are typically tested in patients varying in their phases of drug use. Some people are continuing to use cocaine, some are already abstinent. You can't really expect that a medication is going to work equally in these conditions. You can't expect a medication to both initiate abstinence, that is, interrupt ongoing cocaine use, and prevent relapse, that is, decrease the likelihood somebody who's already abstinent will return to cocaine. So in our cocaine lab, after Marian passed away, it was named the Marian Fischman Cocaine Research Laboratory. We did test a lot of medications. And I want to tell you about EcoPeep for the wrong reasons, because I have the dubious distinction of making smoked cocaine even better, even better drug. So, so this is a dose response curve with 12, 25, and 50 milligrams of cocaine. These are the number of choices. The open bar is placebo. When we maintain someone on this D1 antagonist, a 12 milligram dose of cocaine started to feel like a 25 and 50 milligram dose of cocaine. And then when you look at how high they felt a good drug effect, how much they pay for the dose, EcoPeep increased that for all. So they pay more for it, they felt a better effect. So that's not a promising signal. However, we did get the only promising signal with modafinil. So modafinil is an FDA-approved wake-promoting agent. It's a weak but selective dopamine transporter inhibitor. Has low abuse liability. We did a study even among cocaine users to see if they would like its effects, because it has some stimulant-like effects, and they did not. There was no apparent reinforcing effects from it. It's been shown to decrease both IV and smoked cocaine's positive subjective effects. And then the study that Carl led, we looked at smoked cocaine self-administration under 3 different maintenance conditions, 0, 200, 400 milligrams. Participants were given $25 at the start of their session. It's their real money, and they had the option to pay $5 for a particular dose at 14-minute intervals. So we would give them a sample dose. So we'd say, here, try, here's this. We give them a 12 milligram dose and say, this is what's available to you for the session. You have 5 opportunities to pay $5 for that dose that you just got. Or you can keep the $5 and take it home with you. And so, as I said, it's the only medication in our laboratory model to selectively decrease self-administration of these clinically meaningful doses of cocaine, a behavior that's extraordinarily difficult to modulate. And so this figure shows self-administration, open bars, placebo. Both active doses of modafinil decrease self-administration, and they both decrease what participants said they'd be willing to pay for the dose of cocaine. So this is a great signal. Unfortunately, in the clinical trials, there have been mixed effects in these randomized controlled trials. Some showed that modafinil reduced cocaine use provided the patients weren't also alcohol dependent. Others showed there was no effect even when alcohol dependents were excluded. So we wanted to address these mixed clinical findings by assessing modafinil's effects on the decision to use cocaine in a controlled laboratory setting under discrete experimental conditions that attempted to model the decisions faced by cocaine users outside of the laboratory. So it's a tiny bit of complicated design, but we tested maintenance on placebo and 300 milligrams of modafinil for 21 days. And participants would decide if they would initiate cocaine self-administration and how much they would pay if they had been exposed to both cocaine-paired cues and a priming dose, quote unquote, a non-contingent dose of cocaine. So they had cocaine on board and their cues were there. Then we'd say, how many doses do you want to pay for the rest of your session? In some conditions, they were just exposed to the cues, and they inhaled a placebo dose of cocaine. So it was just the cues alone. And in the third condition, they had neither cues nor cocaine. We called them in the room and said, do you want to have a session? How much do you want to have if you do? So there was no cue and no prime. In addition, we tested each of these conditions under different costs. So sometimes cocaine was $5, so the condition would be $5, it would be $10 or $15 per dose. So I'm just going to walk you through how this looked. This is under placebo modafinil conditions. So it costs $5, no Q or prime, just Q alone and prime. So we see self-administration for $5, $10 it goes down a little bit. This is all under placebo modafinil. $15 they choose to buy more. They're very rational in their decision making. They choose to buy a little bit less rather. So what does modafinil do? So when modafinil was on board and that cocaine only cost $5, it did nothing. So it didn't matter what else was going on. If it was $10, it started to have an impact. So if there was no cue or prime, there was a marked decrease in cocaine self-administration. If they were alone in their room, they didn't have anything to remind them of cocaine, they would often choose not to initiate a session. If there was just a cue, the same effect. It was a pretty big decrease in self-administration. But once cocaine was on board, didn't matter. They were going. Same for $15. We're seeing an effect if there was no cue and no prime, but once the prime is there, cocaine begets more cocaine. Once people start using it, it becomes incredibly difficult to halt that behavior. This is just the amount of money spent under these different conditions, under placebo maintenance. So you see they're spending more money for the $15 dose, but they, and you see this effect of modafinil again under the no and the cue condition only. So modafinil reduced the amount of money spent on cocaine by 70% under certain conditions. So again, this is not something we see very often. So yeah, the effects vary as a function of the conditions present when the decision to use cocaine is made to initiate or continue cocaine use. So we see these substantial reductions when it was costly and when participants had not had cocaine on board, but there was no effect of modafinil when cocaine was inexpensive or when they had cocaine on board. So these findings parallel really nicely a study Richard Fulton then did, looking at a different strategy to model real-world conditions. So what he did was, instead of shifting cost and so forth, he had the participants choose to use cocaine, but they had to work really hard for it. They had to press a keyboard 2,500 times, and if they didn't choose cocaine, they got to play this game of chance where they had the opportunity to earn a lot of money. They had 4 opportunities to play. So they both had to work hard, and they had this opportunity that was really reinforcing to play a game of chance. And he found that modafinil did not shift cocaine self-administration when the response effort to obtain cocaine was low, and they had only 2 opportunities to play this game of chance. But it was effective when getting cocaine was expensive in terms of the behavioral output and the opportunity to play a game for chance. So what we've learned is that the decision to use cocaine occurs in this complex environment containing both drug and non-drug reinforcers. Steve Negus and Matt Banks did this really nice post-mortem on why we have so many failed randomized controlled trials for cocaine. And they really argue that it has to do with the predictability of both our preclinical and our human lab studies, that we really can't just look at progressive ratio in isolation. We really have to look at the choice. And I think to model the choices that drug users face, and when you reevaluate, they were looking at the drug leucovorin, when you reevaluate the data looking at choice paradigms, it was entirely consistent with the failed trial. So our design models some of these complex choices and may help explain modafinil's mixed clinical effects. It suggests that modafinil should be studied in a clinical trial, monitoring compliance, because that's the other thing in these failed clinical trials, that sometimes people weren't taking their medication. Using a relapse prevention approach, perhaps in concert with contingency management, in which the cost of the drug is integral to the treatment provided. Okay, let me move on to cannabis. So just an interesting shift in my lifetime. So I was in high school back here when cannabis use was pretty high. In the late 1970s, early 80s, it was pretty high. Yes, it was weak, but my husband and I went to a high school that was recently built, and you think about how times have changed. So this was in the late 70s. The high school actually built a smoking lounge for the students. So they had a whole big area so that the high school students would have a place to go smoke cigarettes. Well, they smoked cigarettes, but they also smoked a lot of cannabis in that area. So I can't see high schools building a smoking lounge for students these days, which is a good thing. But this figure just shows how daily use of cannabis is just skyrocketed in relation to earlier years, and that it has exceeded daily use of alcohol, which is super interesting. And in Ziva's talk yesterday, they show that this pattern is definitely persisting. So that's, again, a huge societal shift. So it's estimated about 5.8% of the population meets criteria for cannabis use disorder. Now, the majority meet mild criteria, so it's just 2 or 3 symptoms on the DSM checklist. Nonetheless, 40+% still meet moderate to severe, suggesting it has some impact on their life. And as Alan Budney has shown, it's qualitatively similar to other substance use disorders. There's withdrawal, there's it's disruptive and so forth. So qualitatively, it's the same. And the reasons people seek treatment, they are, perhaps more subtle than some other substance use disorders: failing to fulfill work or personal obligation, memory issues, low energy, and really unsuccessful efforts to cut down. And this is something that's, again, talking to the clinician colleagues, it's been pretty interesting to think about for me. This was a very large face-to-face survey, just showing that only 13% have ever received treatment for their cannabis use disorder. Most prefer self-reliance. I thought I could handle it alone. And this is what the clinicians are saying: it's cannabis, I should be able to rein it in. Why can't I rein it in? And they get actually very hard on themselves at their inability to just rein in a drug that they don't think is that serious. They do not want to quit. There's a fear of stigma also with seeking treatment, and they don't even know where they could go. So that's really important information. But again, John Marian in our group has pointed this out, that they come in so frustrated with themselves and really hard on themselves that they should be able to rein in their cannabis use. So although it's not as severe as opioids or stimulants or alcohol, it's certainly significant to these individuals. And we really don't have an efficacious treatment. Behavioral treatments do work. And so far, medications have failed when abstinence is our endpoint. So if many of these trials, as I'm going to get into, require weeks of abstinence, and no medication has been shown to improve that. So we really need a variety of options, including medications. Josh Lyle published a study showing that, in fact, this is surprising, I think, to many, is that the majority of people would be interested in both behavioral and medication to treat their cannabis use. So back to Marian. In 1995, I was happily doing cocaine work. Sandy was building her heroin lab. This paper came out, and it rocked us. This was Billy Martin, was a renowned preclinical cannabis researcher. Showed that animals maintained on THC, given a CB1 receptor antagonist, went through precipitated withdrawal. We were shocked. Just didn't think it would happen. So there had been hints of something like cannabis dependence, but really nothing convincing. So in my memory, Marian, Sandy, and I were talking about this paper, and Marian said, "We have the lab for this. We really need to study this whole thing of cannabis dependence. Who wants to do it?" And I said, "I'll do it." As I said, Sandy was very busy with her heroin research. And that changed the course of my entire life. So here we have this human laboratory model of cannabis use disorder where participants come and live in the lab. Heavy smokers. They've been smoking 2 to 4 grams a day throughout my 30 years of studying them. Wake and bake, don't miss a day. And we can measure their behavior. When they're living in this lab, we really get a 24-hour measurement of all their behaviors. So back in 1999, we published our first study characterizing cannabis withdrawal. People would move into the lab, they'd smoke active cannabis, we'd switch it to placebo cannabis, and we could just capture the time course of these withdrawal symptoms because they vary in their time course. First day, people stop eating completely, their sleep is disrupted. The mood symptoms really peak around days 2 to 4. Sleep stays disrupted for quite a while. So there is this constellation of symptoms that we see, and we really think it contributes to the maintenance of daily cannabis use. And just again to show how much she meant to me, I still have this hanging in my office on my bulletin board. When I passed around that paper in 1999 for my colleagues to read, she wrote something very sweet on it and self-deprecating, and it's still hanging on my board. So now we have withdrawal. Let's look at medications development for relapse prevention. Can we decrease cannabis withdrawal symptoms to decrease the likelihood that people will return to cannabis self-administration? So we have this lab. We tested a lot of medications over the years. And we could see what they did to withdrawal, and then what they did to our model of relapse, which is, again, after they've been in an abstinent phase, we offer them the opportunity to return to cannabis self-administration. They're going to pay some serious money if they want to, but they have the option. And so some medications made things worse. Some medications were pretty good at treating the withdrawal symptom, but they didn't do anything to shift choice to self-administration. So for us, that's not good enough. And we think maybe decreasing withdrawal is necessary but not sufficient for reducing cannabis relapse. It's similar to nicotine replacement. Our most promising is Nabilone. Anyone who knows me says I always talk about Nabilone, and I'm going to now. Because it really, very nicely, you just have to give it once a day. It lasts quite a while, very nicely, just reverse the withdrawal symptoms and decrease choice. So, with relapse prevention, it requires a period of abstinence. Without abstinence, there's no relapse to prevent. Yeah, people seeking treatment for cannabis use disorder rarely go to inpatient treatment where abstinence is enforced. In Europe, they do. In the United States, they certainly don't. Most don't achieve abstinence as outpatients, and for many, it's not even their treatment goal. For the majority, it's not even their treatment goal. So medications that facilitate a reduction in ongoing cannabis use is a solution many patients want, and one that can significantly impact their lives. So we started to look more towards this. We didn't have as many options to look at, but we had a few. Many think cannabidiol attenuates the rewarding effects of THC. That kind of became the lore. So we tested a range of doses pre-treatment before cannabis administration, and said it did absolutely nothing. Naltrexone, there's a lot of preclinical data showing the interrelationship between the opioid and cannabinoid system, and naltrexone was pretty promising. When they were maintained on naltrexone, the cannabis effects were lessened and their self-administration was reduced. It's not profound. It's not like when you give naltrexone with opioids, but it's perhaps more like alcohol, where it just shifts things down. And that hasn't been tested in a clinical trial. I just like to talk about the pregnenolone analog now, AEF0117, because that's the one we had the most success with. And so this is again with Pierre V. Piazza, who made this discovery that pregnenolone binds to a specific intracellular site on the CB1 receptor, distinct from where THC and other CB1 agonists bind, and acts as a signaling-specific inhibitor of the CB1 receptor. And this is very different from rimonabant, which just sits on the CB1 receptor and blocks all activity and produces serious psychiatric effects. So this just shows cannabis, THC binds to the CB1 receptor, produces intoxication. But they discovered when THC concentrations were very high, pregnenolone was produced, and it went to this pocket, a binding site on the CB1 receptor, and they knew it was a specific binding site. And with that, it really shifted the intoxicating effects of cannabis. So it's acting, again, in a signaling-specific way. So THC is binding to the receptor. It produces all these intracellular effects on cyclic AMP and beta-arrestin 2 and phospho-ERK. But with pregnenolone on board, it's binding to that one little pocket. THC binds. Some of that activity, intracellular activity, continues, but phospho-ERK is blocked, and so there's just that signaling-specific inhibition. Now, pregnenolone per se is not easily druggable. It produces steroid hormones, and that would be a problem. So they developed a non-metabolizable pregnenolone derivative, AEF0117, and this medication was shown to decrease self-administration of a CB1 agonist in mice, and in squirrel monkeys, really very dose-dependently decreased self-administration of THC, and at a very low dose, decreased reinstatement of drug seeking. But because rimonabant is so scary, we really wanted to do a head-to-head comparison. So rimonabant alone decreases food intake and body weight. That's what it was being investigated for as a potential clinical treatment. It increases anxiety and depression. It precipitates withdrawal, increases glucocorticoid secretion. AEF0117 does none of that at extremely high doses. So again, the safety is really clear. At no dose did it have any of these effects. So this is, again, just a cartoon showing the difference between the two. This is an agonist binding to the CB1 receptor. antagonist blocking everything, total blockade. And then AEF just blocking a little bit of the activity, so much better tolerability. So, you know, we were able to, with the NIDA's help, move this into humans and do all the phase 1 studies demonstrating their safety, then move it into our lab with the cannabis smokers. So that was the really exciting part. So we wanted to test the effects of AEF in daily cannabis smokers. Each were exposed, each moved into the lab for 5 days. In one phase they were on active AEF and another on placebo. And we could really look at the direct effects on abuse-related subjective effects and cannabis self-administration. So this is, I feel, a good cannabis effect. When we gave them a controlled amount, about 67 milligrams of THC, the peak score is 100, so people are really feeling the effects of cannabis in a very good way. NIDA cannabis, PS. And we see the low dose decreases and the higher dose really decreases, I feel, like a good cannabis effect. Similarly with cannabis cigarette liking, they really liked the effects, and the low dose and the high dose decreased it. This is ratings of intoxication. Here we didn't see the same dose dependence with AEF, but we see a significant drug effect. And then our key secondary endpoint was self-administration. So this is time in the day. As the day went on, people really self-administer more cannabis, and the low dose did nothing, but the high dose significantly decreased self-administration. Oh, something strange is happening. Anyway, we wanted to confirm we weren't going to precipitate withdrawal. I was nervous about that, even though it didn't happen in animals, and there was no evidence of that. So that's all good. This had it move then into a very large, the largest, I think, multi-centric pharma-sponsored clinical trial in cannabis use disorder, led by Francis Levin, who's the head of our division. 11 clinical centers, double-blind, placebo-controlled, 333 patients, so that's a big N, treated once a day for 3 months. And there were 4 arms. There was 3 main groups: the placebo, 0.3 once a day, and 1 milligram once a day, each in 90 to 91 patients. So they started off on a 4-week grace period where we just didn't do anything about measuring their cannabis use, but we gave the medication time to get up to steady state. So let's talk about the preliminary findings. So of these 33, 82% met criteria for severe CUD, and that's not surprising. We're asking them to take an experimental medication for 3 months. The good news is this was safe and well tolerated. I don't know if that beeping is for me, but you know, rimonabant per se tends to increase anxiety and depression, and this medication went in the opposite direction. So again, we keep confirming how safe this medication is, and it was also, there was good dose linearity. Good dose linearity, so they as soon as the medication was discontinued, they went back down to where they should be. Okay, so now let's talk about primary efficacy. Was that the defining feature was percent patients using fewer or 1 day per week. It's a pretty high bar, and these are the findings, and they are not significant. So this is looking at the 3 dose conditions. This is placebo. About 2.5% actually met the criteria. That's a very, very, very low placebo response, and the medication did not do much to shift this. These are the secondary endpoints: complete abstinence or using 2 or few days per week. Again, no effect. So, of course, this is extraordinarily disappointing. But really important. So I'm going to be talking about all different contortions of these data because we really need to learn from this. We cannot repeat what happened with cocaine, where we just tested up to 60 medications and threw away any that didn't meet the initial criteria. So this very large trial, what can we learn? First off, continuous endpoints are better than binary endpoints. So our criteria was yes or no, did you meet 1 or fewer days per week? When you look more at number of days per week, we start to see a better pattern of effect, that over time the highest dose tended did decrease the number of days of cannabis use per week. So I think that's a really important endpoint. We have to look at patient goals. What do they want? It's all been very top down, yet most are not motivated to quit cannabis, but we're demanding it of them. So here they did a questionnaire in this study asking how motivated are you to quit cannabis, and a scale from 1 to 10, and only 24% really looked highly motivated to quit cannabis. Many might have said I wanted to reduce, but we didn't ask them that question. We asked them, how do you want to quit? Now, if you just look at that high motivated group, you do see a significant effect at the highest dose in the number of days per week, dollars spent, and their urine. So another important consideration for future trials. The other interesting thing is moderate versus severe CUD. So in my study, most met criteria for moderate CUD. In the larger multi-site, most met criteria for severe. When you match for moderate, it did parallel the human lab study. So again, the RCT reproduced the human lab findings when the CUD's diagnosis was matched. And we've never really seen this shift in cannabis self-administration before. Really just do believe further clinical study is warranted with this medication. I very briefly want to describe other large studies because I really think this, as a field, and many think this, we really need to come up with better endpoints for cannabis use trials. Shoot. I tested this yesterday and it worked okay. Cyril D'Souza had really great preliminary evidence showing that if you can raise, by blocking the degradation of anandamide, raise endogenous anandamide levels, you can see shifts in cannabis withdrawal and also cannabis use in cannabis-dependent men. So we had great preclinical data, moved it to the clinical trial, and tested the effects of this FA inhibitor in a 12-week study, about 50% moderate and severe. His primary outcome here was change from baseline in number of times per day of cannabis use. So again, we all come up with our own endpoints. This has come from clinicaltrials.gov. It's not been published, but if you compare placebo and the active medication in terms of number of times of cannabis use today, it's not jumping out as a very robust effect. Amy McClay-Clark also did a very nice large study based on very good preliminary data, looking at varenicline, the nicotine medication, showing this partial agonist in our pilot study. 17% achieved abstinence versus 5.4% in the placebo group. So she had a very nice large study. Her endpoint was total number of cannabis use occasions in weeks 6 to 12. And again, clinicaltrials.gov, but just to make the point, there was a reduction in the active group, but again, I don't know of the significance of that. So here we have 3 different large studies looking at percent days per week, number of use occasions per day, number of use occasions per week, 3 distinct outcome measures, and none appeared to shift the primary endpoint, despite really promising preclinical data. So now if you look at just these other large, over 100, an adult CUD, so Lee published a systematic review showing 60 unique outcomes when you look at cannabis treatment trials. So again, it'd be nice if we could come together on something meaningful. Linzaris and John Marian have some intriguing, I'm going to try to wrap this up really quickly, but Linzaris looked at nabiximols, which is an oral mucosal spray of THC and CBD, did a study in cannabis dependence, and looked at number of days of cannabis use over 12 weeks. And what he found was that the placebo group used 53 of those days, and then the nabiximols group used 35. So going down from 4.4 days a week to 2.9 days a week, maybe. This is all really intriguing. Maybe that's meaningful. Maybe the patients think it's meaningful. We don't really know. There was no other changes, but he did see a significant difference there. Similarly, John Mariani looking at quetiapine, similar 12-week study. His primary outcome was weekly cannabis use categorical, heavy, moderate, or light, and amount of money per week. Did find that quetiapine increased the odds of shifting someone from a heavy cannabis user to a moderate cannabis user. That also may be clinically significant, but we don't know. So Frances Levin then, after these studies came out, went back and looked at all of her failed trials, because they didn't produce 3 weeks of abstinence, and showed that all 3 did show a reduction in categorized cannabis use. Starting at week 5, these medications all shifted people from high use to medium use compared to placebo. What is clinically meaningful? So we're seeing these shifts down, but is it enough? So again, Erin McClure published this important paper doing a secondary analysis of CUD RCTs at MUSC and showed that reductions in cannabis use, 50% reduction in days, 75% reduction in use, was associated with clinician-assessed improvement and a reduction in the marijuana problem scale. So she's linking these changes in days to something we can kind of hang our hat on, something it's showing it's having some kind of effect. So this was a secondary analysis. There was no change in measures of quality of life. That's a really high bar too, particularly for cannabis perhaps, because can we really expect changes in quality of life, within a short 1 to 3 month study? There was a recent paper published by people with lived experience arguing you need to look at quality of life that matters to us. And I'll get into that a little bit more. But this is a really important first step. We can go into a priori studies now, kind of looking for these as endpoints and looking to see if we can associate it with something significant. So just to summarize cannabis, abstinence as a primary endpoint is problematic. It may take weeks, it may take years, not weeks. It's not what patients want. Again, the clinicians tell me, patients will come in saying, yes, I want to quit, I'm going to set a quit date, and they will never set a quit date. And each week it's like, hey, how about a quit date? They don't want one. And, again, in the United States, inpatient treatment's not an option. So the working hypothesis is a reduction in use and the amount used is a best outcome measure, particularly if we can link it to something clinically significant. NIDA seems open to this. FDA, who knows? Who knows if we'll have an FDA anymore? We really need a priori studies to define efficacy and the degree of cannabis use reduction that's clinically meaningful. Just very quickly, and got 1 more minute. So in the human lab, we have many true negatives, several false positives, but we would have had many more if we didn't have self-administration in the mix. It's important to model what's most clinically relevant for the drug. Abstinence initiation models may be better for cannabis since the majority are still using cannabis. In terms of randomized controlled trials, we need to define efficacy using continuous outcomes, not limited to abstinence. And both for cocaine and for cannabis, reductions in use can be clinically meaningful. So again, it's broadening our minds about that. And really patient-centered outcomes. Integrate patient-centered measures of meaningful change in drug use. Are people happy going from using 7 days a week to 4 days a week? They might be. That might be all they're coming in and asking for. So I think we really need to capture that much better. And some final thoughts on Marian before I close up. So on September 10th, 2001, we showed up at work to find out Marian, our beloved mentor, was gravely ill. And September 11th was September 11th. So it was an extremely rough week for those of us at Columbia on top of the world. So that was a really, really rough. She had scientific integrity and rigor and really emphasized the work-life balance. This might sound very funny to people, but when Sandy Comer and I were the first really running kind of the lab studies, and we were in our early 30s and we wanted to have children, Marian asked us if we wouldn't mind taking turns having children, and we said sure. I don't think many HR would have approved, but we loved her, so we did. And this Sandy's first baby, Taylor, was born in January 1995, and my son Jack was born in November of 1995, so we took our turn. I went on to have Liam, and then she went on to have her son Nick, taking turns. She gracefully excelled at both science and parenting, instilling us with the confidence that we could too. Sandy and I gave her one of her memorial talks, and this is one of the things I said with the joyful tone she said about having children was genuine, clearly reflecting the joy she took in her own. She had 3 children, and evidenced by the behavior of my sons, who never hesitated to run to Marian's open door to sharpen her pencils on those inevitable days when I had no choice but to bring them with me to work. This is with Francis Levin's 2 kids. And then me, I get to enjoy my mentee's children, Aziza's son, Harlow, at CBDD. But she died as she lived, with elegance, warmth, and bravery, and just had a tremendous impact on my life. So now I just want to end with CBDD and some pictures, because CBDD, you know, with these difficult times, what I have really appreciated more than ever is the solace I get from these colleagues and friends I've had for 30 years, and CBDD has been a big, big part of it. So hopefully you'll recognize some of our faces, your faces in this group, all taking at CBDD. And our children would never see the inside of many of these resorts if it weren't for CBDD. So that's Adam Basaga, that's Ziva's children, this is Elise's, and Carl Hart's child, that's Elise's son. And scientists are fun. I don't know about many other professions, but next time you're at study section or at CBDD, just turn to the person next to you and start chatting, and invariably they have something interesting. If not their science, they have a weird hobby, there's something. Science is a great group of people, and I have really treasured this over the years. So here are some science friends that some of you will recognize. And finally, I just want to acknowledge the Division of Substance Use Disorders. They are Prairie Voles as well. This group have been together, we have been together for a long, long, long time. And even with what we're going through, we're sticking it out together. This is the Cannabis Research Laboratory. These are my current mentees, Maggie Badillion, who's here, Carolina Root, Hannah Harris, Tanisha Carney-Williams just got a great job at Duke, but I'm still mentoring her. And I have to thank NIDA, not only for the funding over the years, but this is like Christmas Day when the cannabis arrives. Look at all that cannabis. Each of those tins holds 300 cigarettes. And then finally, most importantly, Jack, Liam, and Jim, and that, I thank you. Woo! Yeah!
Yeah. Yeah, Meg. Woo.